Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 18. Philippians 2, 14 through 18. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. We've been going through Philippians in an expository fashion in a way, but with the idea of expanding on our understanding of what joy is. And I took it upon myself a year or two ago to do a study on joy because it was something I needed to understand. It was something that was in many ways elusive to me. I didn't understand how people could just be happy all the time. And sometimes when you read scripture, you get the impression that, rejoice always. Again, I say rejoice. Well, does that mean that I'm wrong if I'm not just happy all the time? And how am I supposed to be happy all the time? There's a lot of evil and wickedness in this world that just can get you down. And you read through the Psalms, for example, and they're not happy all the time. And I really struggled and wrestled with this idea of joy. What does it mean to have Christian joy if it's not that? Because I didn't think it was that. That was this sense of I'm just supposed to be emotionally elated all the time. And I knew it couldn't be that, but I didn't quite know what it was. And it helped me in many ways to go deeper into this understanding of what Christian joy is. And this is why I want to go through this with you as we go through Philippians, because I know that it helped me, and I hope it'll help you just as much to have a better understanding of what joy is. And so we've been going through Philippians asking, how do we cultivate joy? Because I think that's how we understand joy, is that it's cultivated. It functions very similarly to other aspects of the fruit of the Spirit. Patience is cultivated. And it's cultivated over time by engaging things. And love is a part of the fruit of the Spirit. Love isn't just an emotion. It's something we cultivate over time toward other people. And we love different people in different ways. And it's cultivated by engaging things. And certainly at times, there are emotions involved in how we love people, but it's not based on emotions. And I think joy, as being a part of the fruit of the Spirit, is very similar. It's something we cultivate. It's a rich kind of joy that happens as we engage God, as we engage the Christian life and life as Christians are expected to live. And it's really cultivated over time in this way. And so we've gone over what are different ways we cultivate joy. We saw things like participation, partnership, and that kind of this idea that we are partners in Christ. And this morning is not going to be so much of an action that really helps us to cultivate joy, but it's going to be this understanding and really processing the knowledge that we are children of God. This is what Paul calls us here in Philippians chapter 2. He says in verses 14 and 15, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Many people, I think, if not the majority of us, have some kind of natural inclination and yearning to be a part of a family of some kind. And this happens, of course, sometimes to our biological families, but sometimes our biological families are, to put it frankly, can be pretty messed up sometimes. And so we find this in other areas. Maybe in our jobs in our workplace, we treat it like a family. Or the people who share the same hobbies as us. We kind of cultivate a family within these different areas. And I think that there is something in us that God put in us to be a part of a family, this yearning, this natural inclination. And I think God had put it in us for a reason. It's not for nothing. It's because we are to be a part of God's family. In fact, this word, child of God, is not to be taken lightly. You have, for example, images, like in John's gospel, where Jesus says that we are born again of water and spirit. Right? When you're born, you are born into a family. Or in Romans, Paul talking about how Jesus is the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. This idea of being brothers and sisters of Christ. We are in a family. We are all children of God. In fact, family is how we understand what it is to be Christian. I'd like to read for you an excerpt from a book called Knowing God. I highly recommend it to anyone, written by J.I. Packer. He wrote this book called Knowing God, and he wrote the following. You sum up the whole of New Testament religion if you describe it as the knowledge of God as one's holy Father. If you want to judge how well a person understands Christianity, find out how much he makes of the thought of being God's child and having God as his Father. If this is not the thought that prompts and controls his worship and prayers and his whole outlook on life, it means that he does not understand Christianity very well at all. For everything that Christ taught, everything that makes the New Testament new and better than the Old, everything that is distinctively Christian as opposed to merely Jewish, is summed up in the knowledge of the fatherhood of God. Father is the Christian name for God. Our understanding of Christianity cannot be better than our grasp of adoption. And if you read, for example, Romans, you'll find that Paul corroborates this very much, that we are adopted into God's family. This is an essential aspect of who we are, and I think a part of how we cultivate joy. This joyful knowledge that we are a part of a family that is the family of God. So I first just want to speak briefly on this idea that we are children of God, because this is an idea that I want to begin by noting. It is found throughout the Bible. It's a very, very biblical concept that we are of God's family, and the Bible is filled with this family language. In fact, in the New Testament, the most common word to describe Christians is brothers. And they use brothers to mean both brothers and sisters. That's the most common word to describe a Christian in the New Testament, brothers. It's not disciples, it's not saints, it's not Christian itself, although disciples and saints are used quite a bit. But brothers is used far more than any other word to describe Christians. And so you have this very family-oriented language that drives the New Testament concept of what these people were doing and what they were a part of. In fact, if you look at the genealogy in Luke chapter 3, I won't turn there, but you can find it in Luke chapter 3, verse 38. When Luke records the genealogy of Jesus, he takes it all the way back to Adam and then says that the father of Adam is God. And it's very important because Luke is describing the genealogy of all of mankind. as being sons and daughters of God, as God being the Father of this genealogy leading up to Jesus the Messiah. And so we want to keep in mind that the Bible is filled with family language, and Christians have been adopted into this family. In fact, I am going to read this one passage. If you hold your fingers here in Philippians, in Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, Paul writes, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." And the reason I'm pointing that out is because Paul says the reason Jesus was sent was for our adoption into God's family. You have this idea that God is purchasing back his children who have been sold to sin, sold to slavery. So I want us to, before we begin looking at this passage, just to realize that we are children of God, and that this is an honor and a privilege that we should reflect on, that we should do our best to wrap our heads around, to really believe, and not just acknowledge, but to believe it. That we are a part of this family. We are God's children, first and foremost. And really this knowledge of our honor and our privilege, I think, is a source of where we cultivate joy. Just the understanding that we are children of God. We are adopted into God's family. So, looking at this passage then in Philippians chapter 2, I want to read verses 14 through 16, and we're going to pause there and reflect on these. Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain." I want you to notice that Paul says we are these lights that shine, but the primary light that shines is the relationship amongst Christians. I think it's sometimes assumed that our primary light that we shine in this world is going to be like our good deeds as we go out there. And I think that's certainly true, that is a light that we shine. I don't want to neglect that. But this is how we shine as lights. He says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing." Why? "So you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights." He's telling these Christians not to be grumbling and disputing amongst each other, because your Christian relationships are the lights that shine in the world. And I think it's important to understand that that is not just a light that we shine, but in fact, it's probably the primary light that we shine. Right? Even Jesus himself said in John 13 that the love we have for one another is how all people will know that we're his disciples. And I think you have the very similar concept here, that if you have Christians who are not grumbling and disputing, but have a good, loving relationship with one another, that is the primary light that shines, that we shine in this world. I want you to, just take a moment and reflect on a biological family, like of any kind, atomic family, larger family. Reflect on a biological family who are just a model of what a family should be like. I'm sure we've all met someone like that. We've met a family where they are, to put it in this language, it's better than our family. Like, it just seems like this is a better place to be than my family. And when we see that, isn't there a part of us that just wishes, like, I wish I was in this family? I'm not even talking about Christians. I'm just talking about a good, healthy, biological family. When you come especially from a background where your family is not so healthy and not so good, you look to these other families and you wish, like, I wish I was a part of that. I wish that was my family. But now take a moment and consider the opposite, because I'm sure we've all met biological families who were not so good, where awful things may have gone on there. How much do you want to be a part of that family? When you see that, do you really want that? You see, the light that we shine in this world is our Christian relationships. I don't think it's the only light, but I think it is the primary light. And there are many people who have drawn away from the church because they didn't see good relationships. And they went looking elsewhere for good relationships that they could be a part of. And unfortunately, I've seen that in churches I've been a part of previously, where there was just unhealthy relationships amongst the Christians. And that's not appealing to people. It's really hard to reach out and to bring people into that when they see things like, grumbling, disputing, fighting. You see people just hating each other. No one wants to be a part of that. We are children of God, and we shine as lights in this world. And one of the primary ways we shine as lights in demonstrating the glory of God to other people, in demonstrating the goodness and the kindness of God, is through our relationships within the church. That's actually going to be one of the primary lights that we shine. In fact, I think that's exactly what Paul gets at here. And I think that's exactly what Jesus gets at, like I said in John 13. That's how people know we are disciples of his, by the love we have for one another. Now, I don't think that this has nothing to do with verse 16. In verse 16, Paul kind of transitions into this by saying, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. This is language that Paul often used, that he wanted to be able to present a church he had worked with to Christ as spotless and blameless. He wanted this church to be presentable. That when Christ sees the church, Christ is glad, and Paul has not, as he says, ran in vain or labored in vain. But I don't think that this is all that separate from holding on to our Christian relationships. In fact, I think our Christian relationships very much has to do with this idea of holding fast to the word of life. That we, as children of God, now I'm going to emphasize that throughout the sermon. We, as children of God, God's sons and daughters, as co-heirs with Christ, we shine this light, and in our relationship with one another, we hold fast to this, as he puts it, to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. I think that is a primary way. Not only is being a child of God in our relationship with one another as children of God a primary light that we shine, but our relationship with one another as children of God, I think, is also a primary way we hold fast until the end. Let's take a moment and go through the opposite, and maybe some of you have experienced this. It's really hard to hold fast until the end when your relationship with Christians aren't good. It's really hard to hold on to that when our relationships with other children of God is just not good. And so we as children of God, and our relationship to one another as children of God, we shine as lights in the world in this relationship. And we also help one another hold fast until the end. I think our relationships within the church as fellow children of God is such an important focal point in this passage. I think everything in this passage really hinges on this. That it is how our lights shine. It is how we hold fast until the end. This word, just as an aside, in verse 15, Paul says that you may be blameless and innocent. This word blameless is interesting. It's in the Greek, it's amemptos. And it actually has, I think, an interesting kind of history and background that comes behind it. The word comes from this deity, like an idol, who is called Momus. And Momus was like the god of bickering. He was the god who complained about everything. He always had something to complain about in every single situation. That's who this God is. And the idea of being blameless is to be amemptos, that is, not momus. That is to say that the way Matthew Henry puts it is the idea is to live in such a way that even Momus himself couldn't blame you for anything. Now this passage here in verse 15, this idea that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, is actually, I believe, a direct reference to Deuteronomy 32 and verse 5. In Deuteronomy 32, you have the Song of Moses that he gives to Israel. And in verse 5, in this song, Moses is predicting that Israel is going to fall away from God. And he says, Deuteronomy 32, verse 5, they have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. So in the Old Testament, you have this foreshadowing of the apostasy of Israel, that they would no longer be God's children. They would be blemished. They would become a part of the crooked and twisted generation. And to contrast this, you have Paul then in Philippians chapter 2, who's telling them that you should be blameless. You should be lights shining in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. You are the children of God instead of those who had apostatized and fallen away from being children of God back in Israel's history. So we are these children of God, and we shine as lights in this world. And although our light can shine in many ways, the ways we interact with strangers, the ways we interact with our biological family, maybe family we have who aren't Christians, our lights do shine in those ways. But what I want us to take away here is that actually the primary light that's being shined in this passage is our relationship with one another. And that our relationship with one another doesn't just shine a light, but it is how we hold fast until the end. Now, looking at these last two verses here in Philippians chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, Paul writes, even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. So we are children of God, and we are children of God who shine as lights, but we are also children of God who make what I'm calling co-sacrifices. Because if you read this passage carefully, you see that there are two sacrifices being made. Paul says, even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering, that's one sacrifice, upon the sacrificial offering, that's two, of your faith. There are two different sacrifices here. And the idea is that they are offering this sacrificial offering, the churches, and Paul is adding on top this drink offering as a sacrifice to really increase the value of their sacrifice. So you have two people making sacrifices, these like co-sacrifices, and one is meant to increase the value of the other. And I think that's so interesting. That Paul had this idea that his sacrifice was actually meant to increase in value the sacrifice of someone else. Because the truth is that when we make sacrifices, we often want the credit for it, don't we? Like we make sacrifices and we want people to say, well, they made the sacrifice. And we want God to see that we've made a sacrifice. But I mean, here's the real question. If you're making a sacrifice in order to be seen, are you really making a sacrifice? And I think that's a hard question to answer. And I think Paul's attitude is one that is worth taking on. This idea that my sacrifice is not even about me. That's what makes it a sacrifice. I could make a sacrifice so that you get even more credit for your sacrifice. And I just think that is so remarkably selfless. That it's worth pointing out and worth noticing that for Paul, he says, verse 17, he says, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Like he is glad to make this sacrifice that would increase their sacrifice and their credit before God. There's a short story written by the novelist Kurt Vonnegut. Back before he was a novelist, he wrote a bunch of short stories. And in this one short story, I as far as I know, I won't forget this. I think of it often. There's a character in there who he sacrifices a lot of his time in order to take care of someone in his family. And Kurt Vonnegut makes the note. He says that's when he realized that sacrifices were really sacrifices. And that is so profoundly true that oftentimes we want to get the credit for making a sacrifice that isn't really a sacrifice. And yet Paul's attitude, I think, is, as I said, remarkably selfless, that he was going to make a sacrifice that would increase the credit of someone else's sacrifice. He was so concerned with their sacrifices that even his own offering was meant to increase their offering. And I think this is an important point for us as children of God, that we make these kind of co-sacrifices. That my sacrifices aren't about my one-time event and getting the credit from God. It's about doing something for you so that even your sacrifices are greater than they originally were. And you have this upbuilding and this exhortation where people are sacrificing on behalf of someone else so that their sacrifices are even greater ones. And we work together in making these sacrifices, not just in my accruing credit from God and doing what I can and you're on your own. But really, my sacrifices are meant to help you in your relationship to God and even your sacrifices. Really interesting passage if you take a moment, I think, to reflect upon it, that there are two offerings being made here by Paul and by the church. And I think it just goes even farther to show what it means to say that we are a family. A family made up of the children of God. As we saw earlier in chapter 2, Jesus, as a part of our family, as a part of setting the tone for what it means to be a part of this family, he gave up everything. Right? He emptied himself, as we read a few weeks ago. He made sacrifices to build us up. And that is the example of what it means to be a part of God's family. And so we, as children of God, as brothers and sisters of Christ, we make these co-sacrifices with one another, and we build up one another as we do so. Because as Christians, that is who we are. We are children of God. We have all been purchased. We have all been adopted into this family of God. And our relationship to one another shines as a light in this world. Our relationship to one another helps us to hold fast until the end. Our relationship to one another is one of building up, of one of making sacrifices to increase your sacrifices. And our relationship to one another, I think, is essential in cultivating joy. Understanding and realizing and knowing that we are children of God is essential for what it is to cultivate joy in our life. At this time, we offer an invitation, and if you are not a part of God's family, I invite you to be a part of it. I don't know that we can have deep, cultivated joy apart from it. I invite you at this time to consider your status as a child of God and what that really means. Not just the responsibilities we may have because of it, but also the privilege and the honor to be called a child of God. If there's anything we can do for you, if you need prayers, if you have questions, if there's anything at all, please make your need known even now as we will stand and sing the invitation song.